Hi, everyone. I'm Jonathan. I'm a senior in the Department of Molecular Biology. And this summer, I worked with Prevention Point Philadelphia, which is a harm reduction center in the Kensington neighborhood of Philly. My research was funded through an internship with the Program for Community Engaged Scholars. Um, and so just for a little bit of background on my research was about the opioid crisis. And the opioid epidemic was declared a national emergency in 2017 after over 70,000 overdose-related deaths that year, the majority of them being related to opioids. Um, since the 1960s, with the advent of methadone maintenance therapy, medication-assisted treatment has been effective in treating addiction to opioids. More recently, the shift has focused to using buprenorphine as a medication, often in combination with some sort of behavioral therapy. Substance use is particularly prevalent among homeless populations who face unique obstacles in MAT that often take the form of practical barriers. These can look like a lack of mailing address or phone number, or a lack of a safe storage location that can lead to missed appointments or medication theft. And as these build up over time, they can lead to treatment failure. And so what I was interested in with this project was looking into the effects of housing insecurity on treatment failure as measured by traditional measures such as medication adherence and program retention, and practical barriers to MAT, which is kind of a new thing that hasn't really been studied in the field. And for that, I'm looking at appointment attendance and medication security. I'm looking specifically in the Kensington community because it's a community that's known as the epicenter of the opioid crisis in the northeastern US. And it's also widely affected by housing insecurity. So to conduct my research, I conducted a retrospective chart review using 8 months of follow-up data from MAT patients at Prevention Point. This was a total of 297 patients for me after I removed 10 due to missing housing information. I compiled a database using electronic health records, intake forms, and case management notes. And using this database, I cleaned and analyzed it in R through multiple imputation and multivariate regression analyses. Before I go too much into my results, I first wanted to talk about how I classified my participants in their housing statuses. So I used a 4-point housing insecurity score that was used for some time at Prevention Point, with 0 representing no housing insecurity and 3 representing the highest level of housing insecurity or street homelessness. I mentioned the 4 outcomes that I was looking at previously. And just to review the overall results that I found for each of them, for unstably housed individuals, especially those at higher levels of housing insecurity, I found that medication adherence was lower, appointment attendance was lower, program retention was lower, and the frequency of missing medication reports was higher. For each outcome, I showed both a distribution and a regression model in panels A and B, as you can see for figures 1 and 2. And those results are pretty self-explanatory, as I just mentioned. For figure 3, in panel A, I'm showing a Kaplan-Meier plot, estimating the proportion of participants who remained in treatment over time. As you can see, there's a really sharp drop at the beginning, and that represents all patients who had an intake and indicated that they were committed to continue with treatment, but never followed up after that. This represents about 20 to 25% of the population for unstably housed individuals, and a slightly lower proportion for stably housed individuals. As you can see over time, the proportion of unstably housed individuals who remained in treatment were about 10% lower than those stably housed individuals. Panel B for this figure is showing the distribution of final program status as separated by housing status. And as previously mentioned, retention was lower among the unstably housed individuals, and those who left without discharge were more commonly unstably housed. What's interesting to note is that I separated discharges into self-discharges and provider-initiated discharges. And you can see that self-discharges were more common among people with stable housing, usually because self-discharge um, it was initiated by participants who were looking for other forms of treatment, usually something that would be more effective, and usually that indicated some sort of commitment to long-term treatment. Whereas patients who are discharged by providers were usually discharged because of suspected medication diversion. And this usually meant that the providers found that they had been faking their urines and that they were most likely selling their medications because buprenorphine has high street value. Looking onto figure 4, aside from the distribution and regression plots, there is also a plot showing the frequency or the average number of reports per person for stolen and lost medications. And you can see that even when separated into different reasons, people with unstable housing reported missing medications at higher rates than their stably housed counterparts. And so overall, I found that traditional measures of treatment failure and practical barriers to MAT were more common among unstably housed individuals than stably housed individuals. And that was kind of expected, that supported my hypothesis, but something that was interesting to note for me was that when housing insecurity was broken down onto this 4-point scale, the effects were only significant for individuals at the highest level of housing insecurity or street homelessness. And I had expected that, you know, the effects would look different for each level of housing insecurity, but I thought it would be more on a linear scale. But instead, there is no significance to the results for people in like temporary programs or long-term programs. The only significant results were for those who are street homeless. And so this suggests that actually increasing shelter access or other kinds of temporary housing support can have major impacts on treatment when immediate access to permanent housing through programs like Pathways to Housing or Housing First programs is unavailable. And so Prevention Point actually found this to be really useful information because they actually run their own shelters in addition to their MAT program. And so they were hoping that they could use this information to advocate for increased funding to those programs. So some remaining questions that I still have after this. One is, what other measures of treatment progress are potentially affected by housing insecurity? These practical barriers to treatment haven't really been investigated before in MAT. And so two that I found were appointment attendance and medication security, but I'm sure there are more out there. And I'm hoping that maybe more provider interviews can help me identify more that I can potentially look at within the same data set I already used. Another question that's more relying on future and current and future data is, how does housing insecurity impact the effectiveness of MAT using telemedicine? And so recently, Prevention Point has actually shifted more towards using telehealth in their MAT program because of the COVID pandemic. And this has actually really improved their treatment in a lot of ways. It's lowered the barrier because insurance requirements don't force providers to take urine to make participants take urine tests at every appointment. And so this is kind of like reduced the policing in MAT for Prevention Point. But at the same time, people who are unstably housed are more likely to lack the technology for telehealth. And so I'm really interested in seeing how these two kind of conflicting effects have impacted the overall program. In conclusion, I found that housing insecurity poses a practical barrier to MAT, and these practical barriers can significantly increase the likelihood of treatment failure. Just to wrap it up, I want to thank my Prevention Point supervisors, LB, M, and Kaylee, who've been amazing throughout the summer, and also my supervisors from the Process program, Marie and Trisha, for making this opportunity possible for me. Thank you.